right before I got up here. I told Micah he could sing like whatever songs he wanted. My topic's so like out there, there's really no songs that could go with it. So the very first song he sang was "It Won't Be Very Long." I thought it was like a subliminal message for like keep it short. So this morning, or evening, there you go. Okay, I'm tired. Ooh, okay. This could be a long one, whether you want it or not, right? I want to talk about scientific discoveries and their biblical foretelling. There's a large movement in science, really. A lot of people are trying to use science to disprove the Bible. I think we all know of the evolution versus creation arguments and stuff. That's not this lesson tonight. This lesson's not about trying to like bash that, those crazy scientists and they don't know what they're talking about, and if only they had faith and trusted in the Bible. But instead I wanted to talk about a dovetailing between the two, about how we have a biblical foreknowledge given to us about several scientific matters that are found in the Bible, and how science, with time, and even as we'll discover here in our next few slides, that even within the last 4 to 5 years has just been able to verify the things that the Bible has told us since the beginning. I'd like to talk to you about an underground ocean. It was more recently discovered in 2014. Let's look at Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. That's where we're going to start this evening. So this is kind of a sermon of sermons, I guess. It's multiple topics. We're just going to kind of jump around different ideas and places in the Bible where the Bible had already foretold us certain scientific facts were true, but until more recently, we were just able to discover that these cases that we're about to talk about could in fact be true. So Genesis chapter 7 and verse 11, it says, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened." Let's also look at Job chapter 38. Job also talks about this particular instance. Job chapter 38 and verse 16. It says, "Have you entered the springs of the sea, or have you walked in search of the depths?" This is, as I think Tim alluded to this morning, a conversation between God and Job and a bunch of sarcastic questions that he obviously couldn't answer. And God asked Job, "Have you entered the springs of the sea? Have you been there? Have you seen it?" And of course, Job goes, "No," and honestly, most people, even today, would still not quite understand what is God trying to allude to, this idea of fountains of the deep and the springs of the sea. In 1977, scientists first discovered hydrothermal vents while exploring an oceanic spreading ridge near the Galapagos Islands. In 2014, more recently, scientists discovered a liquid rock, believe it or not, a substance that they believe came some 400 miles below the Earth's surface. It's believed that the current amount of known water could fill our oceans 3 times over. That's below the Earth's surface. So what I'm trying to summarize, and I'll expand upon this thought, there's a rock that scientists have now decided to call ringwoodite. It's a rock that came up from volcanic activity. Again, 2014 was the first known time that they found this type of rock. It's very porous. It's almost like a rock that's a sponge at the same time. It's very weird. They believe, again, it's all theory, because obviously no one can get 400 miles below the Earth's surface. I like this picture. I found it online. Yay, Google. So there's, as we know, probably from science, as we did like earth sciences or whatever in our middle school, high school, whatever, we know about the earth, and there's multiple layers in the earth, right? There's an upper mantle and a lower mantle, the outer core, the inner core, the whatever, right? Okay? So we now actually, science has added this new layer since 2014 that was just discovered, and it's that one highlighted red. It's called transition zone. between the upper mantle and lower mantle, they believe that that transition zone is actually entirely this rock substance that they have now called ringwoodite. The ringwoodite can hold large volumes of water. So that's that list on the very far left side. It says 410. That's 410 miles below the Earth's surface, and that goes through about 650 miles. So you got about 240 miles deep, and the entire width of the circumference of the Earth holding this material called ringwoodite. Again, it's theory, I know. But again, theoretically then, if this ringwoodite, which they did discover, and they believe it is some sort of amount of distance below the Earth's surface, it's able to basically hold and maintain water. So it is actually possible that this large volume of water, which could, if they are true from what they theorized and surmised, if this area was holding water, then that water, if was pushed to the surface of the Earth, would be able to fill our oceans 3 times over, which would completely flood the Earth. It would be an absurd flooding of the Earth. This is a picture of the ocean's floor. I'm not entirely sure exactly what portion, could be off the Galapagos, as we just talked about earlier. But they're able to explore the depths of the oceans, and as the Genesis account says, that the fountains of the deep were opened due to like a certain volcanic activity. We all know that Earth is being liquefied and spit up right from beneath the ground. Well, it looks like it's smoke or something, but again, this is the ocean's floor. The white substance that's coming out of that tower, the thing is called a chimney, is what they call it. And out of that, the white material isn't smoke, because again, we're underneath water. It's actually silica. It's blowing minerals, rocks, and stuff like that from up underneath itself. We're at the ocean's floor, right? We're at the floor of the Earth. Like, it doesn't get any more. We have, ground level, and then the ocean drops, and then we're at the ocean's bottom right now, and then it's spewing water from below the ocean currently. So in 2014, they were able to discover, in the previous slide, 1977, they discovered that these vents, right, from like volcanic activity, hot springs, things of that nature that we're kind of all familiar with. This is more verifiable that water is spewing from the ocean's floor, and again, where is this water coming from? And they believe it's coming from that transition zone slowly. But then, of course, in Genesis' account, God says that I specifically will open these vents. He says that I will open the springs of the ocean to allow an absurd amount of water to rush, not only from below, but then from above. We know it rained an absurd amount as well. So with those two accounts combined, we get basically the Great Flood. So until 2014, until this rock was found, and then the theories were formed that, wow, we really could potentially have this much water below the Earth. The flood was a hoax. The flood was a joke. It couldn't have happened. Where would this large body of water come from? It makes no scientific sense. We get it could rain, and sure, it could rain a lot, but to flood the entire Earth and the amount of water that would be needed is truly unfathomable until we start accounting for, we actually have basically a layer of a sponge rock material underneath the Earth that if God were to force the water up and out, then it would flood the Earth, and then as it recedes, it would just re-permeate into the ground and go back down to the transition zone where it's to this day. So, fascinating. Yay, science. All right, I can see the excitement in people's faces. This is having the effect I wanted this lesson to have. It's interesting to me, people, okay? It's cool, all right? It's really nifty stuff. Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 22. Let's read that really quick. Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 22, we're going to make it just a really quick point and then move on. It says, "It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in." As far back as we can count. So this Isaiah was written roughly between 600 and 800 BC. Okay, the first known account of anybody theorizing that the earth was round is 300 BC by a man named Pythagoras. I don't know if he's the same like Pythagorean theorem guy or not, but anyway. So about 200 to 300 years later, the first known man to theorize that, you know what, guys, I don't think the earth is flat, surfaced. But the thing is, it wasn't really well received. Most people, all the way up until the 15th century, still believed that the earth was flat. It wasn't I don't want to, I guess, over-exaggerate, like, oh yeah, everybody was retarded and they just completely thought that the earth was flat and no one had a clue what was going on. That's not the case. There's a large number of people who did believe, and it was already proven through, I don't know what the word, I'm struggling with the word I want to use. But basically, people were able to look out the horizon, like you're on the ocean, and you can look out at the horizon, you can see the tip of a mountain in the distance. And then as you approach the mountain gets larger, you see more of it. So then obviously that lent to a curved earth. But then some people thought it was kind of like this. That's why I have this picture. It's almost like this half-curved bubble, but then it is truly flat at the same time. So I just kind of like that picture. I thought it was funny. But so a lot of people theorized that the earth was flat for the longest time, like I said, all the way up until about the 15th century. But simply, the Bible already stated that in Isaiah chapter 40. I mean, it was known 600 to 800 BC at the very least when Isaiah said that God sits on the circle of the earth. And it's kind of like, well, obviously it's not flat. There you have it. Another interesting thought is that humans were made from earth. We kind of all know. We know and we don't know, I feel like. You know, I mean, I get it, right? We all have faith in the Bible. I believe that man is made from dirt, right? It makes sense because God said it so, but I guess realistically, do you know, can you scientifically prove that you are just dirt? It's kind of interesting, like, you know, we see mummies, right? Whenever you open up a tomb, and they've been decaying for like 1,000 years or whatever it is, and they're just dust, right? You touch them, they disintegrate kind of a thing because they're so frail. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7, it says, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being." Also in chapter 3, verse 19, it says, "In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return." Okay, well, again, I get it, but let's scientifically prove it. So you have a little chart of a man on the left, and it tells the percentages of what we're made up of. Our bodies are 65% oxygen, 18% carbon, 10% hydrogen, 3% nitrogen, and other various unmeasurable, like super minute amounts of various things. Trace elements are at the bottom, like borium, chromium, cobalt, copper, fluoride, iodine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. SOM, soil organic matter, is also made up of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, which are all the main ingredients that make up a human body. So the only thing that really distinguishes us from dirt is a soul. I mean, when you really think about it, that we're animated, that God breathed it into us, and so here we are, a living, breathing being, but then once we die and our souls depart from us, our bodies begin to decay. And then if you were to mix us up into the ground and you measured our contents versus a scoop of dirt somewhere, you would have almost the exact same composition. Like we really are dirt, like when you really break it down. Again, going back to that mummy idea. Fascinating stuff. So, enter in this mysterious man. His name is Matthew Fontaine Maury. Matthew Fontaine Maury is known for discovering that there are currents in our ocean. In the mid to late 1800s, he became head of the U.S. Navy's Department of Charts and Instruments, only to discover that the Navy had very few charts of the ocean. Like, go figure, right? He ended up getting the nickname Pathfinder of the Sea, and he got that name because after he inherited this job, I guess, of, okay, well, like, chart the oceans, tell us where islands are for, like, military reasons and things of that nature, he believed and has actually surmised that he was a Christian and that he actually got the verse, which I'm about to read, building the suspense, we're going to get there, that he got his ideas from the Bible, actually. So what he decided to do is he sailed out to various points in the ocean and he threw bottles into the ocean, glass bottles, right, the kind you like read up on the shore and whatever. And inside each bottle he wrote the coordinates of where he was at in the ocean. So as he's throwing these bottles out, the coordinates are whatever I threw this bottle, and then he would send people out to the coasts of all kinds of continents and say, find my bottles. And then they found the bottles. I found the coordinate that you dropped at X, Y, whatever, latitude, longitude, I don't know, I'm not a charts guy. And so I found your bottle off the coast of Asia, and you said you dropped it here. And then the next guy says, I found bottle whatever, and you dropped it off of the coast of Africa. And I found whatever, right? So he did this just a ton of times. Until he was able to discover that there are literally currents in the sea. You know, you think of the sea as a non-moving object. It's like you fill up your pool, right? Like, find the currents in your pool. Well, if you spin around really fast, which is really fun, then you can make the water start doing like a toilet bowl effect or something. But like, there's no current in your pool. It's just a body of water that sits there. And people didn't really understand this until Matthew Fontaine-Maury discovered it, and that's actually talked about in Psalms chapter 8, verses 6 through 8. So Psalms chapter 8, verses 6 through 8. You have made him to have dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, even the beasts of the fields, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea that pass through the paths of the sea. Because the fish, I think, Finding Nemo, right? We all got that, right? We all nailed it, like a lot of people, young kids. Okay, what are the turtles riding in? The turtles, they're you know, ooh, gnarly dude, whatever, right? They're in like the stream that's inside of the ocean, right? They find a current and they just like chill in the current until they arrive where they want, and then they get out of the current. Okay, people didn't really fathom that was a thing. Again, Psalms written roughly 1,000 BC, and some parts, some are written 1,000, some are like 600. It's a wide range, but they knew that fish in the ocean swim in the paths of the sea, in the currents of the sea. But again, not officially recognized or discovered until some 1800. You know, it was just 200 years ago, which is like crazy to think that like we didn't really know of this until just about 200 years ago. Acts chapter 17 and verse 26. I'm going to read that really quick. Acts 17:26 says, and he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. All I want us to do is key upon the fact that he says, and he being God, has made from one blood every nation. Now we know this just because we could read the entire story of Genesis, as we just did about man came from earth, that God created a man and a woman, and that's it. There was a man and a woman, and from them the entire population of the earth as we know it today came from them. Well, science in 2007 can confirm that. What they did is they sent people to four corners of the earth, kind of a thing, and they took blood samples from every race that they could find. And after they took all these blood samples, they compared them and the DNA and genomes and a whole bunch of really fancy stuff. It comes from an article called We're All From Africa. And basically they found out that from all these blood samples that we all have a common genetic code which all comes from Africa. Now, whether Africa isn't the key point that I'm wanting to take on, it's just basically that science will recognize that we all come from a common gene pool. Well, then that would obviously be Adam and Eve. Now, that doesn't really help prove like evolution, because evolutionists will just say, well, yeah, we all come from a common gene pool, right? The toad, the thing, the amoeba came on land and did this and blah, 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 and then a monkey and then a man, and then that man, and then whatever, we're asexual until we eventually form and then grow, and then somehow a woman gets formed, and then from those two beings starts the entire human race. And so this argument's a very weak point for that. I believe Scientology doesn't believe that way. Scientology believes that aliens came down and, like, I mean, for reals, like, I'm not like messing around, that aliens came down and then like deposited large amounts of people. So they would have not the same gene pool. So I guess at the very least, this disproves Scientology and the fact that they don't believe in a single organism or being started the gene pool. That they believe that like a mass of people with varying gene pools started all at once. Whereas this says, no, it all points to the fact that we all came from one common ancestry at some point in time. Germs and bacteria. Something that has honestly only been discovered in the last maybe 100 years, couple hundred years or something like that, like really understood. In Deuteronomy chapter 14 and verse 21, I'm not going to take the time for the sake of time to read these. I don't know, I might have time. Yeah, I'll go ahead and read them. I think I'm doing okay. Okay, Deuteronomy chapter 14 and verse 21. We have a huge list of do's and don'ts, right? Deuteronomy and Leviticus is just don't do this, don't eat that, don't touch this. If this touches you, you got to clean yourself. You got to purify yourself. You're now unclean. Don't do this, right? It's just this never-ending laundry list. And for the longest time, a lot of them didn't make sense to a lot of people other than God's just like finicky, right? He's super like obsessive compulsive about what we can and can't touch. None of it really makes any sense. Until, like I said, enter in our current century, the last couple hundred years, and then you really can reflect on these things and go like, wow, God really knew what he was talking about. That is so smart. Deuteronomy chapter 14 and verse 21, it says, you shall not eat anything that dies of itself. You may give it to the alien who is within your gates, that it may eat it, etc., etc. So they're not allowed to eat anything that dies by itself. Like if you just find a dead animal, well, it's kind of like, well, if you're hungry and stuff, it'd be a good idea to eat that, or you don't want to be wasteful. But God's like, don't eat a dead animal. Don't just eat it because it just died, right? Why? Lice, fleas, flies, they all carry diseases. They all came from other places. Start eating on the animal. You can obviously get diseases yourself. Don't do it. I find it funny that he says, but if you want to give it to the stranger or the traveler, or someone else, you give it to that dude who just showed up at your gate that he's not in Israel, you can give that to him, but don't eat it. Don't do it. But I don't think it's like a cynical thing. I think it's more like, if they're willing, I think it's more of a, if they're willing to eat it, like they're allowed to eat it, like let them chance it, but like I don't want you eating this. Leviticus chapter 11, verses 8 through 7. Hopping around here. What am I doing? Leviticus chapter 11, verse, when I get there, verse 7 and 8. And the swine, though it divides the hoof, having cloven hoofs, yet does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. Their flesh you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch. They are unclean to you. Also verse 16. The ostrich, the short-eared owl, the seagull, and the hawk after its kind. I don't think I meant to have that in there. I probably did. It's probably a different chapter. I'm not really sure. But anyway, they're not allowed to eat a bunch of animals. And specifically for this point, I just want to say pork. Now, it's fine to eat pork today. As we all know, as the movements, right, we do a bunch of hormone therapies and antibiotics, and we pump a bunch of junk into all of our beef. I'm not up here. I'm not like a PETA representative or anything. Like, I don't really care. I'm just saying that, like, we can now have pork that is edible. It's not really have to be scared of it being contaminated. Back then, pork, like pigs, are filthy, filthy animals. Most times, the parasite thing, as it says, right, parasites can be transmitted by the handling of pork. Like back then, when they didn't have antibiotics, they had no way of treating this. They usually would just roast it over like a spit, right, a spitfire kind of thing, apple in the mouth like you see in the olden days back in medieval times or whatever, and they'll roast it over a fire and they have some dude just cranking it or whatever. You cannot kill the parasites by roasting it over a fire. Like, that is not going to kill the parasite. If it has parasites, that's not going to kill it. Simply handling it is going to give you parasites. Like, it's a super filthy animal. I mean, we feed it the trash. I mean, like, as we know, you feed it slop. You feed it your leftovers. It's like a goat. They eat anything. So, again, super smart, right? God's foreknowledge. Like, don't eat pigs. But then all the Israelites are going like, why can't I eat pig? I don't see what the deal is. It tastes delicious, right? Bacon. It's like, it's amazing. But you just can't do it. Why? Because they're not willing to risk the fact that you're going to like get all these diseases. And like honestly, the Black Plague would have probably spread throughout the Israelite nation and killed them all if they didn't obey half of these rules. Leviticus chapter 13, verse 31. Leviticus 13, 31, it says, "But if the priest examines the scaly sore, and indeed it does not appear deeper than the skin, and there is no black hair in it, then the priest shall isolate the one who has scale 7 days." Now this is if you have some weird skin abnormality that may be leprosy, kind of looks like leprosy, you're not really sure, you're quarantined for 7 days. No one's allowed to go see you, you're not allowed to touch anyone, you go in, I don't know what the thing is, like they got a hut for him or something, I don't know. But they put him, somehow they isolate him for 7 days until they can prove whether it truly is leprosy or some other contagious disease. Verse 46 is then if it really is leprosy, and he says, "He shall be unclean all the days he has the sore, he shall be unclean, he is unclean, and he shall dwell alone, his dwelling shall be outside the camp." This is truly interesting because quarantine, the concept of quarantine, because again, the concept of germs and the concept of bacteria and the concept of this can spread if I touch you, or, I get a fluid of your spit or tears or urine or whatever, right? If I get some kind of something in an open sore of mine or whatever, I will get what you have, right? That concept is like mind-blowingly not prevalent in that day. But God, without explaining, God didn't need to have like the, whatever, Homer's book of like medical, I don't know, Christy knows whatever that name is, like that huge book of like medical stuff, right? They didn't have that. He just said, don't do it. Don't touch this person. He's unclean. He has a sore. Don't touch him. Like, I don't need to explain to you why. Don't do it. And then we find out, it wasn't until 1377 is what I could find. This comes from the U.S. National Library of Medicine. 1377 is the first known occurrence of medical quarantining, where people are like, oh man, this thing is contagious, it's spreading, we should separate the people who are getting sick with whatever until either they're better or they die, to prevent it from spreading to other people. That wasn't practiced until 1377. That's like literally 3,000 years after God said start quarantining people who are showing illness. Like that's like mind-blowing when you really think about it. Like what if like Western civilization and other countries practiced Old Testament stuff, not as a religious thing, but what if they practiced what God said out of the sake of just like, well, maybe God knew what he was talking about. Maybe we should just not eat pork for a while, or for our lives. Or maybe we should, if someone gets sick, we should put them in a separate building or something until we know whether it's contagious or not. But again, like man knows better, and it's like, oh, we don't need to separate them. It's fine. It's like bad. Like, I believe the Black Plague was like, some people believe it was like bad air. It's like, oh, like it's just somehow there's like bad juju air or something. I don't know. So the last point, Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy 23, verse 12 and 13, says, "Also you shall have a place outside the camp where you may go out, and you shall have an implement among your equipment, and when you sit down outside, you shall dig with it and turn and cover your refuse." I'm sorry, I think these verses are hilarious. Like, this is just legitimately gold. So it sounds completely absurd. Okay, when I'm going so if I'm reading it very literally, when I'm going somewhere and doing something, I'm supposed to carry equipment. And then when I take that equipment, if I want to go outside and sit down. So it's like, if you ever want to sit down, you're not allowed inside the camp. You can only sit down anywhere outside of the camp if you bring a piece of equipment with you. And it's like, what in the world are you getting at? So if anybody has English Standard or New International or anything else. So what it's actually saying is, when you need to go number 2, you're supposed to take with you a shovel or a spade, and you go outside of the camp, and you dig a hole, and you do your business, and you bury it outside of the camp. I don't want, and he goes on to say, "For the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you and give your enemies over to you. Therefore your camp shall be holy, that he may see no unclean thing among you and turn away from you." The Israelites were not allowed to use the bathroom inside their camp. They were not allowed to use chamber pots, which are like incredibly prevalent in the medieval era and Western civilization and every other civilization era. Like a chamber pot, like you use the bathroom on your bedside, store it next to you, and then eventually the next morning you chuck it out the window or into the streets or whatever, okay? God says, no, if you want to do that, you have to go outside of my camp, bury it, dig a hole, whatever. It's genuinely interesting because no other civilization in recorded history ever did this practice. Everyone else didn't understand bacteria, didn't understand disease, didn't understand anything that goes along with the handling of your feces and your urine and whatever. And they would just, like I said, it was chamber pots and then throw it outside. But guess where outside was? In like the cities, when like industrial era or even like even medieval times, they would typically just chuck it out their front door or whatever, or off to the side. When they had when they actually had paved streets or whatever, they had these curved little gutters, right? Just little grooves in the sides of the roads where you dumped your waste into and let your waste trickle down the sides of the road, right? So then you have inter-black plague, right? People get sick, their sickness and their disease is carried through any excretion of your body, and now you're dumping that into the streets where now people are walking and horses are trotting, and then the kids are running and playing in the streets, and then they're running back into your house and bringing it into your house, and it's like, and then the Black Plague was just absolutely uncontrollable. I know the Black Plague wasn't caused by like feces or whatever, but it didn't help either. It also contributed to the spread. It was like rats and disease stuff and fleas and things that bit you. So, but the bacteria from the Black Plague was in the people's excrements, which were then in the streets. So it's like, again, kind of mind-blowing, because like, wow, if all of Western civilization obeyed this rule, or just thought to themselves, I wonder why God wants us to like separate our feces from our homes. I mean, besides the fact that it's just gross anyway, right? I mean, but like, he actually wants you to separate it for a specific purpose. And you can see the purpose now. It's like, oh wow, like so much disease, typhoid fever, and like so many other fevers, diseases and stuff could have been prevented if they just took it outside and buried it or whatever. I even read in some articles that they had designated heaps, I guess, in some cities or whatever. They would like, it's like a back alley, and they'd all just like throw their stuff like in their chamber pots, and they just throw it into like a heap, which again is not buried, so it's like this big pile. It's just like nonsense. Last point, okay. Thanks for indulging me. So Jeremiah chapter 33, verse 22. Jeremiah 33 and verse 22 says, as the host of heaven cannot be numbered, nor the sand of the sea measured, so will I multiply the descendants of David, my servant, and the Levites who ministered to me. As the host of heaven cannot be numbered, right? It's impossible to count the stars in the sky. Well, just as soon as the Bible said you can't do it, like we're going to do it, right? Like, don't tell them what to do. I can do it, right? So, early astronomers believed and tried to their absolute best and to their credit that the visible sky had between 3,000 to 5,000 stars. Okay, so that's like, well, even before like Galileo kind of stuff, right? So they're like, yeah, it's about 3,000 to 5,000. God's, doesn't know what he's talking about. I can easily count them if I had the time. I just don't feel like it. It's only like 3,000 to 5,000. Galileo came 1564 to 1642, and he made himself a homemade telescope. That's the first telescope that was invented. And when he looked into the sky with his telescope, he saw at minimum a 10-fold increase in the amount of stars in the sky. So then he's all like, oh wow, like this whole time we didn't realize like how many stars were truly out there. Okay? So enter today's society and our current technology. There are roughly, from what we can estimate, because again, we can't actually see them all, we estimate there are 10 billion galaxies in the observable universe. The number of stars in a galaxy will vary, obviously, but assuming an average of 100 billion stars per galaxy, that means there's about that number, which all those zeros translates to 1 billion trillion stars in the observable universe. Okay. And that's just theorizing, right? That's like, well, maybe if, and then maybe if, and then if there's this many, that's how many we can currently see. So just as Galileo looked into the sky and said, oh wow, we went from 5,000 to like 50,000 easily. And then 100, 200 years from then, it's like, oh wow, actually there's more like 1 million, maybe even 1 billion. And then another 100 years from then, telescopes increase and they go, oh my, there's other galaxies out there, and each of those galaxies has 1 billion stars in and of themselves. Our universe is so infinitely vast that only what we can currently see can we come up with this absurd number that is still only what we can observe ourselves. So what can we not observe? Well, another billion trillion stars. So is it truly innumerable? Yes, it is truly, actually, literally impossible. Just as you can't measure the sand, like it's just impossible. You can never actually like weigh all that sand, like that's a measure it, like you just couldn't do it. It's not fathomable. So I think that's it. All right, so science lesson. Get up here and get baptized, okay? Science is awesome. God is great. Just go for it. I know this hasn't been a baptism type sermon. Thanks for indulging me. I know it's been a little bit humorous. I get a little eccentric when I get up here. But it was truly interesting to me, and it was really fun. And I hope you gained something from it. At the very least, you have something interesting to talk about with a coworker. Talk about some of these interesting things. Did you know that the Israelite nation is the first historical observable civilization to ever actually care to get rid of their feces? Everybody else didn't have a care. They just threw it in their streets and stuff. But then why? But then it shows the wisdom of God. Oh wow, I guess Tim, conversation starters, right? Talk about waste management. That's a great conversation starter. That's how you save souls right there. Is talk about waste management. So anyway, I just hope it was a fun lesson. I know it wasn't about baptism or anything, but at the same time, if there is anybody who does have a need or a care, they would like the prayers of the congregation, that time is always made available. We'd be happy to pray along with you if there's anything that's burdening you at this time. If you'd like to come forward as we stand and sing the invitation song.